March 19th, 1945, 31,000 feet above the Rhine Valley. Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon sits in the cramped cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, scanning the sky through plexiglass already scratched by months of combat missions. His fighter group is escorting B-17 seconds, returning from Nuremberg when the radio crackles with urgent German voices, intercepted but not understood. Then he sees them. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s diving from high altitude, positioning for a slashing attack on the bomber formation's vulnerable tail section. Harmon banks hard, pushing his throttle forward, but he knows the geometry is wrong. The German fighters will reach the bombers before his flight can intercept. He watches, helpless, as the 190s close to within 2,000 yards of the B-17 seconds. Then something impossible happens. The sky around the German fighters erupts in perfectly timed explosions. Not the familiar black puffs of conventional anti-aircraft fire arcing up from the ground far below, but bright, precise detonations occurring at exactly the altitude where the fighters are flying. One Focke-Wulf disintegrates instantly. 2 others stagger, trailing smoke, and peel away from their attack run. The remaining German pilots scatter in confusion, their assault broken before they could fire a single round. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Harmon radios his wingman, asking if he saw anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Negative. The flak bursts appeared at bomber altitude, nowhere near the fighter's actual position moments before. Yet somehow, those explosions had found the German aircraft with uncanny precision. What Harmon witnessed was impossible according to everything 1945 aerial warfare doctrine taught. Anti-aircraft shells required direct hits or near misses to damage fast-moving fighters. Hitting a fighter moving at 400 miles per hour with a projectile fired from the ground was like shooting a bullet with another bullet. The statistical probability approached 0. Yet the German fighters had been hit, not by chance, not by volume of fire, but by shells that somehow knew exactly when to explode. This scene, repeated hundreds of times across European and Pacific skies during the final year of World War II, represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied arsenal. The proximity fuse, officially designated the VT fuse, was a miniaturized radar system small enough to fit inside an anti-aircraft shell, sophisticated enough to detect an aircraft and detonate the explosive charge at the optimal distance for maximum destruction. The technology was so revolutionary, so far ahead of anything Germany or Japan possessed, that its existence remained classified until after the war ended. German and Japanese pilots flew to their deaths, never understanding what killed them. Their commanders analyzed wreckage and battle reports but could not explain the impossible accuracy of American anti-aircraft fire. The truth was simple but devastating. American scientists had placed a complete radar system, including transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and triggering mechanism, inside a package small enough to fit in the nose of a 5-inch shell, robust enough to survive the 20,000 G-force acceleration of cannon launch, and reliable enough to function perfectly after being fired from a gun. The story of how this came to be, why it was developed with such desperate urgency, and why the Germans never discovered its secret even when it was literally falling from the sky into their hands, reveals one of the most fascinating technological races of World War II. The development began not with American innovation, but with British desperation. By late 1940, Britain faced an existential crisis. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, the Blitz, was destroying British cities night after night. Between September 7th, 1940 and May 11th, 1941, German bombers killed more than 43,000 British civilians and wounded another 139,000. London alone endured 57 consecutive nights of bombing. Anti-aircraft defences, the primary means of defending against aerial attack, were proving catastrophically ineffective. British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns fired time-fused shells, projectiles with mechanical clockwork fuses set before firing to explode at a predetermined altitude. The gun crew would estimate the target aircraft's altitude, calculate the required fuse timing, set the fuse mechanism, load the shell, and fire. If their calculations were correct, the shell would explode near the aircraft. If their calculations were wrong, the shell exploded harmlessly in empty sky or failed to explode at all. The accuracy requirements were brutal. A bomber, flying at 15,000 feet and 300 miles per hour, covered 440 feet every second. The anti-aircraft shell took approximately 10 seconds to reach 15,000 feet. During those 10 seconds, the aircraft moved 4,400 feet, nearly a mile. Gun crews had to estimate not where the aircraft was, but where it would be 10 seconds in the future, accounting for altitude changes, course changes, and speed variations. They had to set mechanical fuses accurate to fractions of a second. Then they had to fire the gun with precise timing. Any error in estimation, fuse setting, or firing timing meant a complete miss. Statistics from 1940 revealed the grim reality. British anti-aircraft guns required an average of 20,000 rounds fired to achieve one aircraft destroyed. 20,000 shells to bring down one bomber. Each 3.7-inch shell cost approximately £3 to manufacture. Destroying a single German bomber cost British taxpayers £60,000 in ammunition alone, not counting the wear on gun barrels, the labour of gun crews, or the cost of the guns themselves. Worse still, those 20,000 rounds represented enormous industrial capacity. Britain's factories, already struggling to produce enough tanks, ships, aircraft, and ammunition for a global war, were diverting precious resources to manufacture shells that missed their targets 99.995% of the time. The problem was not incompetent gun crews. British anti-aircraft gunners were highly trained, many with months of intensive practice. The problem was physics and mathematics. Hitting a moving target at 15,000 feet with a time-fused shell required solving a three-dimensional calculus problem in real time under combat conditions, while the target actively maneuvered to avoid being hit. Human beings, even highly trained ones, simply could not perform these calculations with sufficient accuracy. Mechanical gun directors, sophisticated analog computers that British and American forces deployed throughout the war, improved accuracy but could not overcome fundamental limitations. These devices could calculate future target positions based on current observations, but they could not account for target maneuvering. A bomber that suddenly changed altitude or course after the shell was fired would evade the predicted interception point. What British air defence desperately needed was a shell that could adjust its detonation point after being fired, a projectile that could sense when it was near an aircraft and explode automatically at the optimal moment for maximum damage. This concept, a proximity fuse, had been theoretically discussed for years. The idea was simple. Place a sensor inside the shell that could detect an aircraft. Connect the sensor to a triggering mechanism that would detonate the explosive charge when the sensor detected the target. It was extraordinarily complex. Any sensor system had to survive being fired from a gun. Anti-aircraft guns generated accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing. This acceleration was sufficient to shatter glass, deform metal, and destroy virtually any electronic component. The sensor system had to function in a projectile spinning at hundreds of revolutions per second, subjected to aerodynamic forces that would tear apart improperly designed components. It had to operate reliably at altitudes up to 30,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and atmospheric pressure fell to 1/3 of sea level. It had to function despite the electrical noise generated by the shell's own passage through the air, despite condensation and humidity, despite the violent shock of gun launch. And it had to be manufactured cheaply enough for mass production. A proximity fuse that cost more than the shell itself would be economically impractical. Multiple approaches were theoretically possible. An acoustic fuse could listen for the sound of aircraft engines. A photoelectric fuse could detect changes in light levels as the shell passed near an aircraft's shadow. A magnetic fuse could sense the iron content of aircraft structures. Each approach had fatal flaws. Acoustic sensors could not distinguish aircraft engine noise from the shell's own supersonic passage through air. Photoelectric sensors required line of sight to the target and failed in clouds or darkness. Magnetic sensors had insufficient range, requiring the shell to pass within a few feet of the aircraft to trigger. The solution, proposed independently by British and American researchers, was radar. A miniature radar system in the shell's nose could transmit radio waves and detect their reflection from nearby aircraft. When the reflected signal reached sufficient strength, indicating the shell was near the target, the fuse would trigger detonation. The concept was elegant. The engineering challenges were immense. Radar systems in 1940 were massive installations. The British chain-home radar stations that detected Luftwaffe raids during the Battle of Britain used transmitters the size of buildings, antennas mounted on 350-foot towers, and receivers requiring truck-mounted equipment. The proposed proximity fuse needed to compress this technology into a package 5 inches in diameter and 8 inches long, weighing less than 4 pounds. In Britain, the Telecommunications Research Establishment began exploring proximity fuse designs in 1940. The research team, led by physicists who had pioneered British radar development, quickly realized the magnitude of the challenge. Vacuum tubes, the electronic components essential for radio transmission and reception, were fragile glass devices. Subjecting them to 20,000 G acceleration would shatter them instantly. The team experimented with ruggedized vacuum tube designs, reinforcing the glass envelopes and modifying internal structures to withstand shock. Progress was slow and frustrating. By mid-1940, German bombing had forced the TRE to relocate from its original location to a safer site in Dorset. Research continued, but resources were limited. Britain's industrial capacity was fully committed to immediate war production. Developing an experimental fuse, no matter how promising, competed with urgent needs for aircraft, tanks, and ships. The breakthrough would come from across the Atlantic, where American industrial capacity and scientific talent would transform the proximity fuse from theoretical concept to war-winning weapon. In June 1940, before the United States entered the war, President Roosevelt authorized the TIZAD mission, a delegation of British scientists who would travel to America to share Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. The mission, led by Sir Henry Tizard, carried with it details of British radar technology, jet engine designs, explosive research, and proximity fuse concepts. The objective was to engage American industrial and scientific capacity in developing technologies Britain could not produce in sufficient quantity alone. Among the American scientists who received these briefings was Merle Tuve, director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Tuve, a brilliant experimental physicist, immediately grasped the proximity fuse's potential. He also understood that developing it would require unprecedented coordination between academic researchers, industrial manufacturers, and military services. Tuve became the driving force behind American proximity fuse development. In September 1940, he convinced the National Defense Research Committee to establish a dedicated fuse development program. The program, designated Section T, brought together physicists, engineers, and technicians from universities, private industry, and government laboratories. The team's first task was to solve the vacuum tube problem. Standard radio tubes could not survive gun launch. The team needed tubes specifically designed to withstand extreme acceleration. This required rethinking vacuum tube construction from first principles. Traditional tubes used relatively delicate internal structures, thin wires supporting electrodes within evacuated glass envelopes. These structures flexed and broke under high acceleration. The solution was to make everything smaller, thicker, and stronger. Engineers designed new tubes with massive electrodes, thick support wires, and reinforced glass envelopes. The tubes were tiny, barely larger than a thimble, but incredibly robust. Testing involved firing prototype tubes from guns and examining survivors. Early designs failed catastrophically. Glass shattered. Internal elements broke loose. Vacuum seals failed. The team systematically identified failure modes and redesigned the components. By early 1941, they had developed vacuum tubes that consistently survived 20,000 G acceleration. These tubes, designated the 6AK5 and related designs, represented a revolutionary advance in rugged electronics. But surviving gun launch was only the first challenge. The tubes had to function in a complete radar system. The fuse needed a radio transmitter to send out radar signals, a receiver to detect reflections, an amplifier to boost the weak reflected signals, and a triggering circuit to detonate the explosive charge when the reflected signal reached threshold intensity. All of this had to fit inside the shell's nose cone, operate on battery power, function reliably despite spin and vibration, and cost less than $50 per unit for mass production. The engineering team divided the problem into subsystems. One group worked on the radio frequency oscillator that would generate the radar signal. Another developed the receiving antenna and detector circuit. A third group designed the amplifier stages. A fourth worked on the triggering mechanism that would actually fire the explosive charge. Each subsystem presented unique challenges. The radio frequency oscillator had to generate a stable signal at approximately 200 MHz, a frequency high enough to reflect efficiently from aircraft structures, but low enough that available vacuum tubes could generate sufficient power. The antenna had to be omnidirectional, since the spinning shell would constantly change orientation relative to the target. The detector circuit had to distinguish genuine aircraft reflections from ground reflections, rain, clouds, and electronic noise. By mid-1941, Section T had developed a working prototype. The fuse, designated T3, was tested at the U.S. Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia. On August 19, 1941, a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, fitted with a T3 fuse, was fired at a radio-controlled target drone flying at 10,000 feet. The shell exploded 60 feet from the drone, close enough that shrapnel severely damaged the aircraft. The test was successful beyond expectations. For the first time in history, an anti-aircraft shell had detected its own target and detonated itself at the optimal moment. The implications were staggering. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The successful test triggered immediate expansion of the proximity fuse program, the U.S. Navy, recognizing the technology's potential for defending ships against aircraft attack, became the primary sponsor. The Navy designated the fuse, the VT fuse, officially standing for variable time to disguise its true nature, though researchers joked it meant vacuum tube. Production planning began immediately. The fuse's complexity meant traditional ammunition manufacturers lacked the necessary expertise. Section T partnered with electronics companies, radio manufacturers, and companies with experience in miniature devices. The Eastman Kodak Company, with expertise in precision mechanics and mass production, became a primary contractor. Western Electric, Sylvania, and other electronics firms contributed specialized components. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States, the proximity fuse program was already well advanced. America's entry into the war transformed the program's urgency. The Navy needed proximity fuses immediately for defending ships against Japanese air attack. The fuse design was refined for reliability and manufacturability. Engineers simplified circuits, standardized components, and developed quality control procedures. By mid-1942, production had begun. Initial fuses cost approximately $70 each, expensive but acceptable given their effectiveness. As production volumes increased, costs dropped steadily. By 1944, mass production techniques reduced the price to approximately $20 per fuse, making them economically viable for widespread use. The fuse's effectiveness exceeded all predictions. Tests against maneuvering aerial targets showed that shells with proximity fuses were approximately 5 times more likely to destroy an aircraft than shells with time fuses. This translated directly into ammunition savings. If a time-fuzzed shell required an average of 20,000 rounds per kill, a proximity-fuzzed shell needed only 4,000 rounds. The difference was more than statistical. It was the difference between effective and ineffective air defense. 5-fold improvement in kill probability meant that a naval vessel under air attack could destroy incoming aircraft with 1/5 the ammunition expenditure. Ships could defend themselves effectively rather than simply filling the sky with shells and hoping for lucky hits. For the American Navy fighting across the vast Pacific, this capability was transformational. The first combat use of proximity fuses came in January 1943 during the naval battle of Rennell Island in the Solomon Islands. American cruisers, equipped with 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused shells, engaged attacking Japanese torpedo bombers. The results stunned observers. Japanese aircraft, accustomed to pressing attacks through anti-aircraft fire, were blown from the sky with shocking efficiency. Pilots who survived reported explosions erupting around their aircraft with uncanny accuracy, shells that seemed to know exactly where they were. The Japanese Navy recognized that American anti-aircraft fire had suddenly become far more deadly, but they could not determine why. Captured proximity fuses, recovered from shells that failed to detonate, were examined by Japanese scientists. The shells appeared to contain standard explosive charges. The fuse mechanism in the nose was damaged beyond recognition by impact. Japanese analysts concluded the Americans had developed improved time fuses with better mechanical clockwork, not realizing they were examining the shattered remains of miniature radar systems. This misunderstanding was deliberate. American forces were under strict orders regarding proximity fuse security. The fuses could only be used over water where unexploded shells would sink rather than fall into enemy hands intact. They could not be used over land where the enemy might recover working examples. Shells that failed to detonate over water would sink into hundreds of fathoms, making recovery impossible. These security restrictions remained in force throughout 1943 and into 1944. The fuses proved devastatingly effective against Japanese air attacks but remained a closely guarded secret. The restrictions frustrated army commanders who desperately wanted proximity fuses for defending ground forces against air attack. General George Marshall personally appealed to Navy leadership for permission to use proximity fuses in ground operations, arguing that the technology could save thousands of American lives. The Navy and the National Defense Research Committee remained adamant. The risk of compromising the fuse's secret was too great. The restrictions would finally lift in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's surprise offensive through the Ardennes caught Allied forces off guard. German aircraft, appearing in strength for the first time in months, attacked American positions with relative impunity. Weather conditions grounded Allied fighters. German ground forces pushed American units back, threatening to break through Allied lines and reach the strategic port of Antwerp. The situation was desperate enough that General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, authorized the use of proximity fuses by anti-aircraft units defending against German air attacks. The restriction against overland use was lifted. For the first time, proximity-fused shells would be fired where the enemy could potentially recover unexploded examples. The first large-scale use came on Christmas Eve, 1944. The Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive air offensive intended to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and gain temporary air superiority. More than 1,000 German fighters and bombers attacked Allied airfields across Belgium and France. American anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with proximity-fused shells, met the attacking aircraft with withering fire. The results exceeded even optimistic predictions. German aircraft fell from the sky in unprecedented numbers. Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of years of combat, reported in shock that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. Shells exploded directly alongside aircraft with no apparent aiming error. Entire formations were torn apart by flak that seemed to track individual aircraft. The German High Command received urgent reports describing the mysterious new American ammunition. Pilots reported shells that exploded without apparent reason, creating perfectly timed airbursts that required no direct hits. Intelligence officers analyzed the reports but could not explain the phenomenon. The conclusion seemed impossible. The Americans had developed some form of guided ammunition, but how could an artillery shell, fired from a ground-based gun, possibly guide itself toward a target? German scientists examining the problem quickly dismissed the idea of guidance. The forces involved in gun launch would destroy any guidance mechanism. The spin rates would make control impossible. Whatever the Americans had developed, it could not be a guided projectile. Some analysts suggested improved mechanical time fuses. Perhaps the Americans had developed clockwork mechanisms of extraordinary precision. Others proposed that American gun directors, the analog computers that calculated firing solutions, had been improved to the point where their time fuse settings were simply more accurate. A few analysts suggested the possibility of proximity detection, shells that could somehow sense when they were near an aircraft and detonate automatically. But this seemed equally impossible. What sensor could survive gun launch? How would it be powered? How could it function reliably in combat conditions? The truth was too far beyond German expectations to be considered seriously. The Germans had their own proximity fuse research program, but it had focused on magnetic and acoustic sensors. These approaches had proven impractical. German scientists had concluded that proximity fuses were theoretically interesting but practically impossible with current technology. They assumed American scientists had reached the same conclusion. This assumption proved fatal. By early 1945, proximity fuses were standard ammunition for American anti-aircraft units in Europe. The effects were measurable and devastating. German air activity declined sharply. Luftwaffe pilots who survived encounters with proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire reported their experiences to their commanders, describing the impossibly accurate flak that made daylight operations suicidal. Night operations became marginally safer, but even at night, proximity fuses functioned effectively. The radar detection range of the fuses was approximately 100 to 150 feet, sufficient that shells passing anywhere near an aircraft would detonate. For fast-moving fighters flying at 300 to 400 miles per hour, this detection range meant shells had to pass only marginally close to achieve kills. The pilots had perhaps 1/10 of a second to recognize that a shell was approaching and attempt evasive maneuvers. By the time they saw the shell or its smoke trail, detonation was already occurring. Statistical analysis from early 1945 demonstrated the proximity fuse's devastating effectiveness. In January 1945, American anti-aircraft units in Europe reported destroying German aircraft at a rate 5 times higher than the previous year, despite firing fewer total rounds. The ammunition savings were enormous. Proximity fuses effectively quintupled the combat power of every anti-aircraft battery, allowing fewer guns to defend larger areas with greater effectiveness. The technology's impact extended beyond air defense. In December 1944, American artillery units discovered that proximity fuses transformed conventional artillery into devastating anti-personnel weapons. Artillery shells fitted with proximity fuses could be set to detonate at optimal heights above ground, creating airbursts that showered shrapnel downward over wide areas. Unlike contact-fused shells that buried themselves in mud before exploding, or time-fused shells that required precise calculation, proximity-fused shells automatically detonated at the most lethal height. German infantry advancing through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge encountered this new horror. American artillery shells exploded 20 to 30 feet above ground, exactly the height that maximized casualties among troops in the open or in foxholes. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers had learned to take cover when artillery fire began. knowing that shells needed direct hits or very close misses to cause casualties. Proximity-fused shells eliminated that safety margin. There was no safe place on the battlefield when American artillery fired. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division during the Battle of the Bulge, later described proximity fuses as decisive in stopping German advances. His paratroopers, outnumbered and outgunned, held critical positions because supporting artillery could deliver devastating fire with unprecedented efficiency. German attacks that should have overrun American positions were shattered by perfectly timed airbursts. Gavin estimated that proximity fuses increased artillery effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 4. A single artillery battalion firing proximity-fused shells could deliver the firepower of 3 battalions firing conventional ammunition. This multiplication of combat power came at a moment when American forces were desperately outnumbered and outmaneuvered. German attempts to understand and counter proximity fuses continued through the war's final months. In January 1945, German forces recovered several unexploded proximity-fused shells from Belgian battlefields. These shells, their fuses intact, were rushed to German research facilities for examination. What German scientists discovered shocked them. The fuses contained complete miniature radar systems, technology Germany had not believed possible to miniaturize to such degree. The vacuum tubes were unlike anything in German production, designed specifically to survive gun launch. The circuits were ingeniously simple yet effective. The entire assembly represented a level of miniaturization and ruggedization that German electronics industry could not duplicate. German engineers examining the fuses realized that even if they understood the principles, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture proximity fuses in meaningful quantities. The specialized vacuum tubes required production techniques Germany had not developed. The precision assembly demanded skilled labor in quantities Germany could not spare. The raw materials, particularly the exotic metals used in vacuum tube construction, were unavailable. Most critically, Germany no longer had time. By February 1945, Allied forces were advancing into Germany from both east and west. German industrial capacity was collapsing under sustained bombing. Even if German scientists had developed proximity fuse designs, there was no possibility of production before Germany's inevitable defeat. The irony was that Germany possessed the basic scientific knowledge necessary for proximity fuse development. German physicists understood radar principles thoroughly. German engineers had pioneered many aspects of radio technology. What Germany lacked was the industrial infrastructure for mass production of complex electronic devices and the secure time necessary for development and testing. America's geographic isolation from the war's fighting fronts provided American scientists and engineers with 3 years of relatively undisturbed research and development. American factories, safe from bombing, could tool up for mass production. American supply chains, protected by oceans and Allied naval power, could deliver specialized materials. This combination of scientific capability, industrial capacity, and strategic security created the conditions for technological breakthroughs. Germany could not match. By war's end in May 1945, American industry had manufactured more than 22 million proximity fuses. This staggering production volume transformed a revolutionary technology into standard ammunition. 5-inch naval shells, 90mm anti-aircraft shells, 105mm artillery shells, all could be fitted with proximity fuses. The technology that had begun as a desperate solution to British air defense problems had become routine equipment for American forces. The human cost of this technology to German and Japanese forces was severe, but difficult to calculate precisely. Conservative estimates suggest proximity fuses were responsible for destroying or damaging several thousand aircraft that would have survived conventional anti-aircraft fire. Each aircraft represented a trained pilot, months of training, scarce resources diverted from other uses. More significantly, the psychological impact of facing impossibly accurate anti-aircraft fire degraded enemy willingness to press attacks. Japanese kamikaze pilots, who had shown willingness to fly into ships despite intense anti-aircraft fire, found proximity fuzzes changed the calculus. Previously, a kamikaze pilot could hope that American gunners would miss or that he could maneuver through the fire. Proximity fuses eliminated that hope. The shells would find him regardless. American naval gunners reported that kamikaze attacks in 1945, when all ships carried proximity-fused ammunition, were less aggressive and less successful than earlier attacks. Pilots seemed to abandon their dives at greater distances, flinching from the accurate fire they could not evade. The proximity fuses development represented one of the most successful scientific mobilization efforts of World War II. From initial concept in 1940 to mass production by 1943 required just 3 years. This pace of development demonstrated what could be achieved when scientific genius, industrial capacity, and military necessity aligned. The program cost approximately $27 million, a substantial sum but trivial compared to the technology's impact. Those $27 million purchased a weapon system that multiplied American anti-aircraft and artillery effectiveness by factors of 3 to 5. In economic terms, proximity fuses represented one of the highest return on investment weapons systems of the entire war. The technology's influence extended far beyond World War II. Proximity fuses established principles that guided post-war weapons development. The concept of smart ammunition, projectiles that could sense their environment and adjust their behavior accordingly, became central to modern military technology. Today's guided missiles use radar, infrared, and laser sensors to detect and track targets. Modern artillery shells contain GPS receivers and guidance systems. Anti-aircraft missiles use sophisticated seekers that can distinguish between targets and decoys. All of these technologies trace their lineage directly to the World War II proximity fuse. The engineering challenges overcome in developing the proximity fuse, particularly the creation of electronics that could survive extreme acceleration and operate reliably in hostile environments, influenced civilian technology development. The ruggedized vacuum tubes developed for proximity fuses found post-war applications in portable radios, test equipment, and early computers. The miniaturization techniques pioneered for fuse production contributed to the broader trend towards smaller, more reliable electronic devices. Security surrounding proximity fuses remained tight even after the war ended. The technology was not declassified until 1946, more than a year after Germany's surrender. American military authorities wanted to preserve the advantage proximity fuses provided. The Cold War was beginning, and proximity fuses represented a significant American technological edge over potential adversaries. Only after the Soviet Union demonstrated its own proximity fuse designs did the United States relax classification restrictions. Even then, many technical details remained classified for years. The full story of proximity fuse development, including the contributions of individual scientists and engineers, only became public in the 1950s and 60s as participants published memoirs and technical histories. Today, examples of World War II proximity fuses are preserved in military museums. They appear unremarkable, small cylindrical devices that could fit in a hand, yet these simple-looking objects represented revolutionary technology that changed warfare. The miniature radar systems they contained, primitive by modern standards, were sophisticated enough to detect aircraft at ranges sufficient for effective anti-aircraft fire. The ruggedized vacuum tubes, engineered to survive, and forces that would destroy conventional electronics, demonstrated that careful design could overcome apparently insurmountable limitations. The production techniques that allowed mass manufacture of complex electronic devices established precedents for the modern electronics industry. For the German pilots who survived encounters with proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, the experience remained vivid decades later. Former Luftwaffe pilots interviewed in the 1970s and 80s spoke with residual shock about the sudden transformation of American anti-aircraft fire in late 1944. They described flying through flak that seemed to track individual aircraft, shells that exploded with uncanny precision. Several veterans stated they had assumed American gun crews had achieved superhuman levels of skill. The idea that the shells themselves contained guidance systems had not occurred to them during the war, learning decades later that they had faced miniature, radar-guided weapons explained experiences that had seemed incomprehensible at the time. The proximity fuse story demonstrates how technological innovation can shift military balance decisively. Germany entered World War II with technological advantages in tanks, aircraft, and tactical doctrine. The United States overcame these advantages not through superior courage or greater numbers, though both played roles, but through sustained technological innovation. Proximity fuzzes represented one element of a broader pattern. American scientists and engineers, given adequate resources and clear objectives, developed weapons systems that German industry could not match. The atomic bomb represents the most dramatic example, but proximity fuses, radar, long-range bombers, and advanced fighters all contributed to American technological superiority that proved decisive in the war's final years. The human element of the proximity fuse story deserves emphasis. Behind the statistics and technical details were thousands of individuals whose contributions enabled the technology's success. Scientists like Merle Tuve, who recognized the fuse's potential and drove development forward. Engineers who solved seemingly impossible technical challenges. Factory workers who manufactured millions of complex devices with the precision necessary for reliable operation. Military personnel who tested prototypes under combat conditions and provided feedback that guided improvements. The proximity fuse succeeded because talented, dedicated people worked toward a common goal with clear understanding of the stakes. For Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon, the P-47 pilot who witnessed proximity phases destroy German fighters in March 1945, the technology remained mysterious until after the war. He completed his combat tour, returned to the United States, and only learned about proximity fuses years later, when declassification allowed publication of their history. Reading about the technology, he finally understood what he had witnessed that day above the Rhine Valley. The impossibly accurate flak that had saved the bomber formation had been the work not of superhuman gunners, but of miniature radar systems guiding each shell to its target. The knowledge did not diminish his respect for the achievement. If anything, understanding the engineering brilliance behind proximity fuses increased his appreciation for the men who had developed and manufactured them. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends into the present day. Every time a modern military aircraft deploys countermeasures against an incoming missile, the pilot benefits from lessons learned developing World War II proximity fuses. Every time an artillery battery fires precision-guided shells, the gunners use technology descended from those early radar-fused projectiles. The fundamental concept that projectiles can sense their environment and adjust their behavior accordingly has become central to modern warfare. What seemed revolutionary in 1941 is now routine. This transformation, from impossible to routine in less than a century, demonstrates humanity's capacity for rapid technological advancement when necessity demands and resources allow. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately about the transformation of warfare through applied science. In 1940, hitting an aircraft with anti-aircraft fire required 20,000 shells and extraordinary luck. By 1945, the same task required 4,000 shells and a proximity fuse. This five-fold improvement in effectiveness came not from better aim or more powerful guns, but from placing intelligence into the projectile itself. The shell could sense its target, judge the optimal moment for detonation, and execute that decision in fractions of a second. This represented a fundamental shift in weapons technology, from purely mechanical systems to electromechanical systems that could respond to their environment. Modern warfare has continued this evolution, with weapons systems that can identify targets, plan approaches, and execute attacks with minimal human intervention. The proximity fuse marked an early step in this ongoing transformation. For the thousands of Allied airmen who survived the war because proximity fuses protected them, the technology was quite literally life-saving. Every bomber that returned safely because German fighters were driven off by accurate anti-aircraft fire, every ship that survived kamikaze attacks because proximity-fused shells destroyed incoming aircraft, every soldier who lived through the Battle of the Bulge because American artillery delivered devastating fire support, all of these outcomes resulted from one technology developed in response to a clear need. The proximity fuse did not win World War II alone. No single technology could claim that distinction, but it contributed measurably to Allied victory and reduced casualties that would otherwise have been far higher. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.